The air in the courtroom felt as cold and sterile as a hospital, but the only thing sick here was the story my daughter was telling. Jessica sat on the witness stand, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She looked every bit the wellness influencer she was trying to become, all flowing fabrics and soulful expressions. Her gaze shifted from the judge to me, and her voice, smooth and practiced, filled the silence. "I had to leave my children," she began, her voice trembling just so, "to heal my own generational trauma, and my mother," she paused, her eyes locking onto mine, "used my journey of healing to steal them from me." The accusation hung in the air, a masterpiece of modern fiction. To understand how we got to that moment, you have to understand the lies that came before it. And the lies that came before it were not the frantic, clumsy lies of a cornered animal. No, they were polished, smooth. They were designer lies, tailored to fit a modern narrative, and they were being presented by a man who was an artist in his field. Jessica's lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies with a silver watch and a voice like warm honey, paced in front of the judge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He wove a story, a tapestry of victimhood so compelling that I saw a few of the jurors lean forward, their faces softening with sympathy. He painted a picture of Jessica not as a mother who had left, but as a sensitive soul who had been crushed under the impossible weight of modern motherhood. He used phrases like emotional burnout and a crisis of spirit. He spoke of postpartum depression as if it were a mystical fog that had descended and spirited her away against her will. "Miss Miller did not abandon her children," Mr. Davies said, his hand gesturing towards Jessica, who dutifully lowered her head. "She made the brave, the incredibly difficult choice to step away in order to heal. She knew she could not pour from an empty cup. She needed to break the cycle of generational trauma for herself and ultimately for Leo and Maya." I sat perfectly still on the hard wooden bench, my hands clasped over my purse. I felt the worn leather beneath my fingertips and focused on its texture, trying to ground myself in something real, because everything he was saying felt like a fantasy. A generational trauma? Jessica's biggest trauma growing up was when the mall ran out of her favorite brand of jeans. An empty cup? Her cup had never been empty. It had just never been her priority to share what was in it. I watched my daughter on the stand. She was a brilliant actress. She had mastered the art of looking fragile, of letting a single perfect tear trace a path down her cheek at just the right moment. I remembered the day she dropped them off. Mr. Davies described it as a heart-wrenching goodbye, a mother forced to entrust her precious children to a loved one for a short time. I remembered it differently. I remembered the beat-up sedan pulling away before the kids could even get to the window. I remembered Leo, his face streaked with grime, asking me if they were going to have dinner that night. And I remembered Maya, my tiny Maya, holding up a worn-out sneaker with a hole in the toe, a silent testament to the loving care she had just come from. Mr. Davies then pivoted to her financial situation. This was the centerpiece of his argument. He described Jessica's subsequent years as a period of profound hardship. He painted a portrait of a woman working menial jobs, scraping by, living in a tiny, bare-bones apartment. "She sacrificed everything," he declared, his voice filled with admiration. Every spare dollar wasn't spent on comfort or luxury. It was invested in her recovery, in therapy, in wellness workshops, in the grueling, expensive work of becoming a whole person again, so she could return to her children as the mother they truly deserved. Jessica looked down at her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly. A performance of shame and remembered struggle. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I remembered a phone call about 5 years in. She'd called me from a coffee shop complaining. I could hear the hiss of a fancy espresso machine in the background. She was upset because the grant money for her artisan pottery collective had been delayed. It was a call filled with the casual entitlement of someone who had never known a day of real financial fear in her life. She spoke of her poverty like it was a trendy accessory she had chosen to wear for a season. The lawyer wasn't just telling a story. He was building a legal fortress around her. He was framing her 11 years of absence not as neglect, but as a necessary, even noble, sacrifice. He made her the hero of her own story. And in that story, I was the villain. The rigid, old-fashioned mother who didn't understand mental health. The woman who took advantage of her daughter's vulnerability to steal her children and alienate them. This was always meant to be temporary. Mr. Davies concluded, turning to face the judge directly. His voice dropped to an earnest, confidential tone. A pause, not a stop. All my client is asking for, Your Honor, is for the court to press play, to give her the chance to reclaim the family that was put on hold, not thrown away. He used the word hold. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. I saw the knuckles, swollen with arthritis from a lifetime of work, of packing lunches, of scrubbing floors, of holding feverish little bodies through the night. I knew what it felt like to hold on, and I knew, with a certainty that cut deeper than any legal argument, that my daughter had simply let go. And I knew, with a certainty that cut deeper than any legal argument, that my daughter had simply let go. The drone of the courtroom's air conditioning seemed to grow louder as Mr. Davies sat down. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the residue of his performance. Then, the judge, a man named Marcus Holloway with tired eyes and a neatly trimmed gray beard, turned his gaze to me. It wasn't a look of pity, but of professional assessment. He was taking my measure. "Mrs. Carol Miller, please rise," he said, his voice even. I stood up. My suit was a simple navy blue, one I'd bought on sale at a department store years ago for job interviews. It was clean, pressed, and it fit. Next to Jessica's flowing, earth-toned ensemble, I probably looked like a relic from another era, but I wasn't there to be fashionable. I was there to be factual. My lawyer, a quiet, methodical man named Mr. Finch, stood beside me. He was the opposite of Jessica's lawyer. Where Mr. Davies was smooth and theatrical, Mr. Finch was all sharp angles and quiet precision. He looked like what I was, a retired accountant. "Mrs. Miller," the judge began, "you have heard the testimony of your daughter, Miss Jessica Miller. You've heard her account of the events of the past 11 years. Is there anything you wish to say in response to her claims of your alienating her from her children?" I took a breath. The air tasted of floor polish and old paper. I could feel Jessica's eyes on me, probably expecting tears, a frantic denial, an emotional outburst that would prove her point about my being a toxic influence. I gave her none of it. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, clearer than I expected. "The timeline my daughter presented is inaccurate." That was all. I didn't elaborate. I didn't call her a liar. I simply stated a fact. A small ripple of movement went through the jury box. "And her claims that you took advantage of her emotional state to gain custody of the children," the judge pressed. "I did what was necessary to provide a stable and safe home for Leo and Maya when they had none," I replied. My answers were concrete. They were solid. They were the load-bearing walls of truth, and I knew they would stand long after the flimsy drywall of Jessica's narrative had been torn away. "Mr. Finch placed a hand lightly on my arm, a signal for me to sit. He then addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice lacking any of the dramatic flair of his opponent, "we do not intend to engage in a battle of conflicting emotional narratives. We believe the facts of this case are not open to interpretation." He walked to his table and picked up a single thin binder. It was plain black, the kind you'd buy at any office supply store. It was my Bible for the past 11 years. "My client, Mrs. Miller, spent 40 years of her life as a certified public accountant," Mr. Finch continued, his tone conversational. "It was her job to track credits and debits, to balance the books, to ensure that every entry was supported by a verifiable source. She believes in meticulous records." He paused and looked at me, then back at the judge. "We will be presenting our own timeline of events today, but more than that, we will be presenting a different kind of ledger, not a financial one, but a moral one. A ledger that tracks promises made and promises broken. A ledger of phone calls never returned, of birthdays forgotten, of responsibilities abdicated." The word ledger hung in the air. I saw Jessica shift in her seat. The idea of an accounting, a real one, with dates and facts, had clearly never occurred to her. In her world, you could just declare your truth and expect everyone to accept it. But I came from a world where the numbers had to add up. I thought about that ledger. It wasn't a binder full of hate or a collection of grievances I'd nursed for a decade. It was a record of survival. It was the stack of receipts from every late-night run to the 24-hour pharmacy for asthma medication. It was the carbon copy of the check I wrote to the school for the field trip Jessica never knew about. It was the log of every parent-teacher conference I attended alone, sitting in a tiny chair meant for a 6-year-old, nodding as the teacher told me what a bright, wonderful boy Leo was, and how Maya had a gift for art. Every entry in that ledger was an act of love, performed in a vacuum of neglect. Every piece of paper was a testament to the fact that I had showed up. Day after day, year after year, I had showed up. And as I sat there in that cold courtroom, listening to the story of my daughter's grand journey, I knew my simple, boring, meticulously kept ledger told the truest story of all. It was the story of what it really costs to raise a family, and it was a debt my daughter had never once offered to pay. It was a debt my daughter had never once offered to pay, not in cash, not in time, not even in a simple phone call. As Miss Finch spoke, the sterile air of the courtroom seemed to dissolve, and I was no longer there. The scent of floor polish was replaced by the sharp, clean smell of eucalyptus and menthol. It was the smell of 3:17 a.m. For most of the world, that's the dead of night. For me, for years, it was a time I came to know with an unwelcome intimacy. It started with a sound. Not a loud cry, but something much more terrifying. A faint, high-pitched whistle, like the sound of wind trying to force its way through a keyhole. It was the sound of a child who couldn't breathe. In the memory, my feet hit the cold wood floor before I was fully awake. There was no hesitation, no fumbling for a light. I knew the path from my room to Leo's in the pitch dark, the way a sailor knows the stars. My bare feet padded down the short hallway, my hand already reaching for the doorknob. There he was, my little grandson, only 7 at the time, sitting bolt upright in his bed. The moonlight coming through the window cast his small frame in a silvery glow. His pajamas were damp with sweat, his eyes wide with a quiet panic that broke my heart every single time. He wasn't crying. Crying required air, a luxury he didn't have. He was just fighting, his small chest heaving, each tiny muscle straining to pull in a wisp of oxygen. That terrible wheezing sound was the only thing you could hear in the quiet house. You can't talk a child through an asthma attack. You can't tell them to breathe through it or find their center. Their body is at war with itself, and you are the only ally they have. My movements were a practiced, automatic ballet born of fear and repetition. First, the nightstand. I grabbed the familiar blue plastic case. Inside was the nebulizer, a small machine that was our most important possession. I unscrewed the little cup, my fingers finding the small vial of albuterol in the dark. A few drops, a click as I sealed it, and the soft tube was in my hand. While one hand did that, the other was already rubbing a thick layer of Vicks VapoRub onto his chest, the familiar, powerful scent, a small comfort in the chaos. It didn't cure anything, but it was something I could do, a ritual of care. I sat on the edge of his bed and placed the mask over his nose and mouth. He didn't fight it. He knew the routine. He leaned into me, his small, hot body trembling slightly. I flipped the switch on the machine. The low hum filled the room, a sound that had become my lullaby. A fine, cool mist began to pump through the tube. I put my hand on his back, feeling the frantic flutter of his ribs. I spoke to him, not in words, but in a low, steady hum, a meaningless tune. My job was to be the calm in his storm. My job was to be the anchor that kept his panic from sweeping him away. We sat like that for 15 minutes, which felt like an eternity. The hum of the machine, the whistle of his breath, and the steady pressure of my hand on his back. In the courtroom, Jessica had talked about her journey, about manifesting her truth. As I sat there in the dark with my grandson, watching the vapor curl around his face, I thought about how you can't manifest a clear airway. You can't use a vision board to unconstrict a bronchial tube. This was the work, the real work. The messy, terrifying, unpaid, 3:17 a.m. work of keeping a child alive. It was a line item on my ledger that had no dollar value, but it was the most expensive thing I owned. Slowly, gradually, the whistle in his chest began to subside. The frantic heaving softened into deeper, more regular breaths. The panic in his eyes faded, replaced by a heavy, sleepy exhaustion. The mist stopped. I turned off the machine, and the sudden silence was a blessing. I kept my hand on his back, feeling the steady, easy rhythm of his breathing. He slumped against me, already half asleep. I eased him back down onto his pillow, pulled his blanket up to his chin, and sat there for another 10 minutes, just watching him, making sure. He was safe. The crisis had passed. I walked back to my room, my own lungs feeling tight with residual adrenaline. I wouldn't sleep again that night. I'd just lie there, listening, until the first birds of dawn began to sing. The sharp rap of the judge's gavel brought me back. The memory faded, leaving an ache in its place. I was in the courtroom again. Jessica was whispering to her lawyer, a small, self-satisfied smile on her face. She had no idea, no concept. She had been on her journey, finding herself, while I had been here, on my watch, making sure her son lived to see another morning. She had been on her journey, finding herself while I had been here, on my watch, making sure her son lived to see another morning. And now, back in the courtroom, her lawyer was ready to present the invoice for that journey. Mr. Davies stood up again, his expression one of solemn reverence, as if he were about to discuss a sacred text. He approached the witness stand where Jessica sat, her previous performance of fragility replaced by a look of weary resilience. "Miss Miller," he began, his voice soft, "could you describe for the court the conditions you were living in during the first few years after you made the difficult decision to leave?" This was the next chapter in the novel she'd written about her life. I gripped the worn handles of my purse, my knuckles white. This was the part I had heard hints of over the years, the myth of her struggle. Jessica took a shaky breath and looked down at her hands, which were resting in her lap. They were lovely hands, slender and smooth, with clean short nails polished in a clear, healthy gloss. The hands of someone who had never scrubbed a floor or scraped burnt food off a pan in her life. "It was hard," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "So hard. I had nothing. I found a tiny studio apartment, the kind with the refrigerator in the main room. The faucet dripped all night." She looked up, her eyes wide and glistening, making eye contact with a female juror. "There were nights, so many nights, I lived on nothing but instant ramen. You know the 25-cent packs? Sometimes I'd splurge and put an egg in it. That was a big night." A murmur of sympathy went through the room. The story was a classic. It was the American struggle narrative, weaponized. I felt a hot flash of anger, so intense it made my vision blur for a second. I remembered my late husband and me, years ago, when we were first starting out. I remembered stretching a pound of ground beef to last 3 meals. I remembered turning the thermostat down to 58 degrees and wearing sweaters indoors to save on the heating bill. That was struggle. What she was describing was a costume party. Her lawyer guided her gently. "And your clothes, Miss Miller? Your personal effects?" "Thrift stores," she said with a weak, self-deprecating smile. "All of it. I had to sell the nice things I had, just to pay for my therapy sessions. My clothes, some jewelry my mother had given me, it all had to go. But it was worth it. Every bowl of ramen, every scratchy sweater from a garage sale, it was an investment in my healing. I knew that if I didn't get better, I'd be no good to Leo and Maya." She was brilliant. She wasn't just claiming poverty. She was claiming it as a noble sacrifice. She was a martyr to the cause of mental wellness. She was turning her back on materialism to embrace a higher purpose. I looked at the simple, elegant linen dress she was wearing. It looked inexpensive, artfully simple, but I knew fabrics. I'd made clothes for Jessica and myself for years to save money. And I knew that kind of linen, the kind that draped just so, wasn't something you found at a thrift store. "So, to be clear, Mr. Davies summarized, turning to the jury, while your mother was, by her own admission, living in a stable home, you were in a precarious financial state, sacrificing your own basic comforts for the sole purpose of one day being a healthy mother to your children." "Yes," Jessica whispered, and now a real tear did fall. "Every single day. Every single dollar I had went to my therapy, my workshops, my healers, just so I could be strong enough, whole enough, to come back for my babies. I had to look away. I stared at a scuff mark on the floor and focused on its shape. Because if I looked at her, at my daughter, I was afraid the rage and the grief would pour out of me in a way that would make me look exactly like the monster she was painting me to be. I thought of the one and only vacation I'd taken in the last 11 years. A 3-day trip to a lake cabin 100 miles away, paid for by cashing in my saved-up credit card points. I remembered packing sandwiches and juice boxes to avoid eating out. And I remembered Jessica calling me during that trip, her voice tinny and distant, telling me she was thinking of going to Bali for a month-long vibrational alignment retreat, but was worried it sounded too indulgent. That was her version of poverty. Ramen and regret. A story spun for an audience, designed to make her look brave. But I knew the truth, and I had the receipts. She had painted a masterpiece of poverty and regret. A story spun for an audience, designed to make her look brave. But I knew the truth, and I had the receipts. As her lawyer, Mr. Davies, sat down, basking in the glow of his client's tearful testimony, my lawyer, Mr. Finch, stood up. He didn't move quickly. He moved with the quiet deliberation of a man who knows exactly where every piece on the chessboard is. "Your Honor," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The court has just heard a moving account of Miss Miller's financial sacrifices during her years of healing. We would simply like to offer some corroborating evidence from that same period." He walked toward the clerk, holding a slim USB drive between his thumb and forefinger. Mr. Davies was on his feet in an instant. "Objection? Relevance? Counsel is clearly about to embark on a fishing expedition designed to harass and embarrass my client." "On the contrary," Mr. Finch replied without even turning to look at him. "This evidence is directly relevant to Miss Miller's testimony regarding her financial state. It is not private. In fact, it was information she herself chose to share with the public." Judge Holloway looked from one lawyer to the other, his expression unreadable. "I'll allow it," he said. "But be quick about it, Mr. Finch." Mr. Finch nodded and handed the drive to the clerk. A moment later, the large monitor facing the jury box, which had been dark, flickered to life. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. And then, there it was. It wasn't a picture of a rundown apartment or a bowl of ramen. It was a photograph of my daughter, Jessica, on a beach. But it wasn't just any beach. It was a paradise of white sand and water so impossibly turquoise it looked like a movie screen. Jessica was in the center of the frame, her body arched in a perfect yoga pose, her face a mask of serene concentration. She looked healthy, toned, and radiant. Behind her, a thatched roof cabana peeked out from between lush palm trees. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for 11 years. It was the breath of validation, the breath of a person who has been called crazy for seeing what was right in front of her eyes. "Mr. Finch," the judge said, his voice now holding a sharp edge of impatience. "The relevance." "Of course, Your Honor," Mr. Finch said calmly. He gestured to the screen. "I'd like to present Exhibit A, a series of posts from Miss Tand, Jessica Miller's public Instagram account. This first photograph, as you can see from the date stamp in the corner, was posted 9 years ago, during the 2-year period she just testified she was subsisting on instant noodles. I watched Jessica, all the color drained from her face, her carefully constructed mask of fragile victimhood shattered into a million pieces. Her mouth opened slightly but no sound came out. Mr. Finch clicked a button. The next image appeared. It was a group shot. Jessica and 5 other women, all in expensive-looking athletic wear, were laughing as they held up green smoothies. The caption below it read, "Finding my tribe and nourishing my soul. So blessed." Click. The next image, a close-up of a beautifully arranged plate of food, sliced mango, starfruit, papaya, and a delicate purple orchid, all set against the backdrop of a polished teak wood table. It was the kind of meal that costs more than a week's worth of my groceries. Click. "Miss Miller," Mr. Finch said, his voice still maddeningly calm as he paused on a photo of Jessica meditating on a cliff overlooking the ocean at sunset. "Could you please read your caption for the court?" Jessica stared at the screen, frozen. I don't remember," she stammered. "Allow me to refresh your memory," Mr. Finch said, and he read her own words into the courtroom record. "Disconnecting to reconnect with my soul's purpose. Grateful for this journey. So thankful to the universe for providing. Number authentic life, number healing, number Costa Rica detox." The words hung in the cold, quiet air. Costa Rica detox. I looked at the jury. Their faces, once filled with sympathy for Jessica, were now hard masks of stone. One woman, the one who had teared up during Jessica's testimony, slowly shook her head, a look of utter disgust on her face. Mr. Davies was whispering frantically to Jessica, but she didn't seem to hear him. She was just staring at the ghost of her own lie, broadcast in high definition for the entire world to see. This wasn't revenge. I felt no joy, no triumphant surge of victory. I just felt a profound, weary sadness. This was simply an audit. It was the first entry in the ledger being brought into the light. The first time the real numbers were being shown. And as I watched my daughter's carefully crafted fantasy crumble under the weight of a single, undeniable truth, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the books were finally, after all these years, going to be balanced. The books were finally, after all these years, going to be balanced. And that photograph was just the first entry, the first major debit against her towering account of lies. Mr. Finch didn't give the jury a moment to recover. He didn't give Jessica's lawyer time to invent a new objection. He simply moved to the next item on his agenda with the unhurried pace of a man laying out bricks, one on top of the other, building a wall of truth so solid it would be impossible to break through. That trip to Costa Rica was not an isolated incident, Your Honor, he stated, his voice as dry as dust. It was merely the most photogenic example of a much larger pattern. Let's examine Exhibit B. Another image flashed onto the screen. This one wasn't a glossy vacation photo. It was a screenshot of a text message exchange from my phone. The date was clearly visible. April 12th, 6 years ago. Maya's 7th birthday. My text was on the left, in a simple gray bubble. Hi, sweetie. Just a reminder it's Maya's birthday today. She's so excited. Maybe you could find a moment to call her? It would mean the world. I remembered sending that text. I'd typed it and deleted it 3 times, trying to find the right words. I didn't want to sound like I was begging or accusing. I just wanted my granddaughter to get a phone call from her mother on her birthday. Maya had woken up that morning and the first thing she'd asked was, "Do you think Mommy will call today?" I told her I was sure she would. Jessica's reply appeared on the screen in a bright blue bubble, sent 8 hours later. Mom, I appreciate the heads up, but I'm in the middle of a very intensive silent meditation retreat this week. I need to hold this space for myself right now. Please send Maya my loving energy. Loving energy. I felt the phantom sting of that phrase all over again. I looked at the jury. Their faces were grim. You don't need to be a legal expert to translate that. It meant, I'm too busy with my own feelings to care about my daughter's. I remembered Maya's face that evening, her lower lip trembling as she blew out the 7 candles on the homemade chocolate cake, her birthday wish so painfully obvious it hung in the air between us. The phone never rang. Exhibit C, Mr. Finch said, and the image changed again. This time, it was a screenshot of an email. The sender was me. The recipient was an old email address for Jessica. The subject line read, Maya's first grade pictures. The body of the email had a short, cheerful message. Look at this little star. She was so proud of her dress. Hope this makes you smile. Attached was a scanned copy of Maya's school photo. She was missing her 2 front teeth and beaming a smile so wide it crinkled her eyes. Next to the email summary, in bold red letters provided by the email server's tracking software, were 2 words. Status, unopened. This email was sent on October 3rd, 5 years ago. Mr. Finch stated. It was never opened. My heart ached with the memory. I had been so proud of that picture. Maya had insisted on wearing a bright yellow dress I'd found for her at a garage sale, calling it her sunshine dress. Seeing that little digital notification, unopened, felt like a door being quietly shut in my face. It was a small thing, a tiny rejection in a long line of them, but it hurt. It was proof that her indifference wasn't just passive, it was a conscious act of not looking, of not wanting to know. And finally, Your Honor, Exhibit D, Mr. Finch said, turning the page in his binder. The screen went white for a moment, and then a simple document appeared. It looked like a page from one of my accounting ledgers. It had 2 columns and a single line of text. Column A, child-related financial contributions from Miss Jessica Miller. Column B, total amount. Underneath, the entry was stark and brutal. Dates: August 2014, August 2025. Total, $0. There it was. 11 years of braces, winter coats, school supplies, doctor's visits, and the occasional, much-needed trip to the ice cream shop after a bad day. 11 years of me stretching my small retirement savings, of taking on part-time bookkeeping for local businesses, of selling off my late husband's old tools just to make sure the kids had everything they needed. All of it was summarized in those 2 big, fat zeros. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. It was the sound of a narrative being crushed under the undeniable weight of fact. This wasn't a story of a struggling mother. This was the documented history of a ghost. A digital trail of absence. The slow, steady drip of 1,000 small abandonments, all leading to this one overflowing moment in a cold courtroom. Jessica wasn't a victim on a healing journey. She was just gone. And her silence, I now realized, had been the loudest message of all. Her silence, I now realized, had been the loudest message of all. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. The images of unanswered texts and unopened emails, followed by that stark, brutal 0, had sucked all the air out of the room. Jessica's story of noble sacrifice had evaporated, leaving behind only the ugly truth of her indifference. I saw her lawyer, Mr. Davies, lean over and whisper something to her, his face tight with damage control. For the first time, the man's smooth confidence had cracked. He looked like a magician whose best trick had just been exposed as a cheap gimmick. Judge Holloway looked down at Jessica, his expression unreadable. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice low and serious, "in light of this evidence, do you have any response to the assertion that you made no effort to contact or support your children for over a decade?" This was it. This was the moment for accountability. A moment for a flicker of remorse, for a simple admission of failure. But that's not who my daughter was. When cornered, Jessica didn't retreat. She attacked. She looked up, and the fragile victim was gone. In her place was a woman blazing with a desperate, righteous fury. She shot to her feet, her hands gripping the railing of the witness box. "Response!" she cried, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "Yes, I have a response. I didn't contact them because I couldn't." She cut me off. Her finger shot out, pointing directly at me. The accusation was so sudden, so audacious, it was like a physical blow. I tried to find them. Jessica's voice cracked with a convincing sob. After a few years, when I was finally getting back on my feet, I tried to reconnect. I called the number I had for her, and it was disconnected. I went to her old house, and she was gone. No forwarding address, no note, nothing. She just vanished. She took my children and she vanished. My jaw went slack. Of all the lies I had expected, this was not one of them. It was so complete, so total in its fabrication, that I could only stare at her in stunned silence. I didn't move. I didn't change my expression. I simply sat there and let the lie wash over me, a tidal wave of fiction. Her lawyer, sensing a lifeline, jumped on it. "So you're testifying, Miss Miller, that your mother, the plaintiff in this guardianship case, took active steps to hide your children from you?" "Yes," Jessica insisted, tears now streaming down her face. "She deliberately alienated me from my own children. She packed them up and moved, and she never told me where they were going. What was I supposed to do? I was alone. I had no money for a private investigator. I was powerless. She knew that. She counted on it. I thought about the move. It had happened about 8 years ago. We'd moved from a cramped 2-bedroom apartment into a small rented house on the other side of town. It wasn't a whim. I'd done it for one reason: the school district. Leo was about to start middle school, and the house was zoned for one of the best public schools in the county. I remembered attending PTA meetings for months beforehand, talking to other parents, researching test scores. I remembered the sheer physical exhaustion of packing every box myself, of convincing 2 friends from my church to help me with the U-Haul in exchange for pizza and beer. Every part of that move had been for the children's future, and now she was twisting that act of care into a weapon against me. She was painting me as a kidnapper. The jury was looking back and forth between us, their faces a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Jessica's lie was a powerful one because it preyed on a common fear: the controlling, possessive matriarch. She was turning me into a monster. I felt a cold calm settle over me. The anger was still there, a hot coal in my gut, but on the surface, I was ice. I watched my daughter perform her heart out, and I felt nothing but a profound, hollow pity. She was so lost in her own fiction she no longer knew what was real. But I did, and I had the proof. She was so lost in her own fiction she no longer knew what was real, but I did, and I had the proof. while her lawyer began to build on this new, spectacular lie, talking about filing police reports and the legal definition of parental alienation, I simply caught Mr. Finch's eye. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had been waiting for it. He rose slowly from his chair. He didn't interrupt or shout an objection. He waited for a pause in Mr. Davies's theatrical monologue and then spoke into the quiet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "Before we proceed, I have a few clarifying questions for Miss Miller regarding this specific timeline." Judge Holloway nodded, his eyes narrowed on Jessica. "Proceed." Mr. Finch walked toward the witness stand. He didn't carry a binder or a file. His hands were empty. "Miss Miller," he began, his tone almost gentle. "Just so the court is perfectly clear, you are testifying, under oath, that after your mother moved, you had no idea where she and the children were living." "That's right," Jessica said, her voice dripping with the pain of a wronged mother. "I had no idea. She was gone. And you are testifying that my client, Mrs. Carol Miller, made no attempt whatsoever to provide you with her new address or contact information." "None," Jessica said firmly, looking at the jury. "She cut me off. Completely." Mr. Finch paused for a beat, letting the finality of her words settle into the room. "Thank you, Miss Miller. That's all I needed to clarify." He turned and walked back to our table. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small digital audio recorder. It was the kind journalists use. It looked insignificant, a small gray rectangle in his hand. "Your Honor," he said, holding it up, "I would like to play for the court a piece of evidence directly pertaining to Miss Miller's last statement. It is a voicemail, left on my client's phone. The message is time-stamped August 15th, 8 years ago, approximately 3 days after my client moved into her new home." Mr. Davies shot up. "Objection! Foundation! We have no way of knowing if this recording is authentic or has been tampered with. The recording was submitted to a certified digital forensics expert, whose sworn affidavit is in this file." Mr. Finch replied without missing a beat, tapping his black binder. The expert confirmed it is an unaltered recording, and voice analysis confirms the speaker is Miss Jessica Miller. Furthermore, we have the original phone right here, from which the message was saved. The judge waved a dismissive hand at Mr. Davies. "Objection overruled. Play the message." Mr. Finch pressed a button. A small speaker on the device crackled to life, and then my daughter's voice filled the courtroom. But it wasn't the trembling, fragile voice we had been hearing all day. This voice was breezy, confident, and dripping with a casual, dismissive arrogance that was 1,000 times more damning than any angry outburst. "Hey, Mom," her recorded voice chirped, bright and tinny in the silent room. "Got the certified letter with your new address." A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the jury box. I saw Jessica's hands fly to her mouth, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated horror. But the recording wasn't finished. "Honestly," her younger self continued, a note of condescending amusement in her tone, "the school district ratings there are kinda grim, but you do you. Anyway, I'm super swamped manifesting my new wellness brand, so I can't really talk. Talk to you later." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was absolute. It was profound. It was the sound of a person's entire character being laid bare for the world to see. Certified letter. The official, legally binding way to ensure someone receives a document. The opposite of hiding. Kinda grim. The insult to the very school district I had sacrificed to get her children into. Manifesting my brand. The final, brutal confirmation of her priorities, spoken in her own cheerful, self-absorbed words. Every syllable was a nail in the coffin of her credibility. This wasn't just proof that she had lied, it was a window into her soul. It showed a woman who had received concrete evidence of her children's whereabouts and had responded not with relief, but with a sneer and a complaint about being too busy with her startup. I risked a glance at Jessica. She was no longer an actress. Her face was a pale, frozen mask of shock. The lie was too big, the proof too absolute. There was no escape. She had been caught not just in a lie, but in her own carefully curated personality. The healed, authentic woman was a fraud, and her own voice from the past had just arrived to testify against her. The healed, authentic woman was a fraud, and her own voice from the past had just arrived to testify against her. The courtroom was a vacuum, all sound and air sucked out by the sheer, shameless audacity of her lie. Jessica had crumpled in the witness box, not like a flower wilting, but like a cheap suit collapsing off a hanger. Her lawyer was trying to speak to her, but she was inconsolable, her sobs finally sounding real, not with remorse, but with the raw panic of being caught. The judge looked down at her, his face a granite mask of judicial contempt. He seemed about to speak, to bring the whole charade to an end, but Mr. Finch held up a single, respectful hand. "Just one final point for the court's consideration, Your Honor," he said into the ringing silence. The judge gestured for him to continue. Mr. Finch turned and addressed the courtroom as a whole, his voice still calm, but now it carried the weight of a final summary. "For the past hour, we have established a clear, documented pattern. 11 years of absence, 11 years of financial and emotional neglect, 11 years of disinterest, confirmed by the defendant's own words and actions." He paused, letting that sink in. "Which brings us to the final and most important question: why now?" He let the question hang in the air. Why, after 4,015 days of silence, did Miss Miller suddenly feel an overwhelming, legally binding need to reclaim her children? What changed? I watched Jessica. Her sobbing subsided slightly. A new kind of fear entered her eyes, the fear of a different kind of exposure. This was the one question she couldn't answer with a performance. Even I had been stumped by it at first. When the papers from her lawyer arrived, I'd sat at my kitchen table for an hour, just staring at them. It made no sense. Why would she want them now? Leo was practically a grown man, Maya was a teenager. The hard work was done. The sleepless nights, the potty training, the parent-teacher conferences, all of it was in the rear-view mirror. It felt like a stranger showing up after the marathon was over to claim the medal. For weeks I racked my brain. Had she finally gotten her life together? Had she felt a genuine pang of regret? I almost allowed myself a flicker of hope, but it didn't feel right. The aggression of the lawsuit, the slickness of her lawyer, it felt like a corporate takeover, not a family reunion. The answer, when it came to me, wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a slow, dawning horror. It started with a piece of mail I'd almost thrown away. A glossy, official-looking statement from an investment firm. It was about a small, almost forgotten part of my life. 15 years ago, my best friend from high school, a brilliant but perpetually broke computer nerd named Sam, had started a small data security company in his garage. He needed seed money. Everyone said he was crazy, that it was a waste of time, but I believed in him. I took a small portion of my $401,000, $10,000. I really couldn't afford to lose, and I invested it. It was an act of faith in a friend. For over a decade, it was just a piece of paper in a file cabinet, a running joke at Christmas about my tech empire. Then, 3 months ago, the impossible happened. Sam's little company, Nexus Safe, landed a massive government contract. Out of nowhere, they were acquired by a tech giant. There was an IPO. The news was in all the financial papers. My little act of faith, my $10,000 gamble on a friend, had turned into a multi-million-dollar windfall overnight. In the courtroom, Mr. Finch walked to the monitor. "Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit E," he said. The screen, which still showed the damning Instagram photos, went blank and was replaced by a crisp, clear screenshot from a well-known financial news website. The headline was large and bold. Data security startup Nexus Safe announces surprise IPO. Early investors see massive windfall. Mr. Finch didn't need to read the article. He just drew the court's attention to 2 key pieces of information. "The date of this public announcement," he said, pointing to the top of the article, "was May 17th of this year." He then held up the legal summons that had started this entire nightmare. "And the date Miss Miller retained legal counsel and filed this custody suit," he said, his voice dropping as he pointed to the stamp on the document, "was May 31st. Exactly 14 days later. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The jury didn't gasp. They just looked at Jessica with a new, final understanding. Every part of her story was instantly reframed. The healing journey wasn't for her children. It was an alibi. The lawsuit wasn't about custody. It was about access. Access to the children, and through them, access to the money. My money. She hadn't come back for her family. She had come back for her inheritance. She hadn't come back for her family. She had come back for her inheritance. The courtroom didn't erupt in gasps or murmurs. It was something far more damning. It was a deep, collective silence of understanding. The story was over. The plot holes were filled. The motive, the oldest one in the book, had been laid bare on a financial news website. Greed. Cold, simple, and ugly. Judge Holloway took off his glasses and slowly, methodically, began to polish them with a small cloth. He didn't look at Jessica. He didn't look at me. He seemed to be studying the reflection of the courtroom lights on the lenses, as if the answer to some profound question was held there. Finally, he put them back on, his eyes sharp and clear. "Miss Miller," he said, and his voice was no longer tired. It was like tempered steel. "In my 15 years on this bench, I have seen a great many frivolous lawsuits. I have seen family disputes born of anger, jealousy, and misunderstanding. But I do not believe I have ever witnessed a case brought before this court with such a profound and cynical dishonesty at its core." Jessica was silent. Her lawyer, Mr. Davies, stood up, but the judge cut him off with a flick of his wrist. "Sit down, counsel. Your client has done enough talking." The judge leaned forward, his hands clasped on the bench. "Let us recap," he said, the word "recap" sounding less like a summary and more like an indictment. "You came into this courtroom and built a narrative of a struggling victim. You claimed poverty while taking luxury wellness retreats. You claimed ignorance of your children's whereabouts while in possession of a certified letter containing their address. You claimed you were alienated from them, when in fact you were, by your own admission, too busy manifesting your brand to be bothered with them. Every point was a hammer blow, driving the nails into the coffin of her case. You have not only wasted the court's time and the taxpayers' money," the judge continued, his voice rising slightly, "you have attempted to weaponize the language of genuine trauma and mental health struggles to perpetrate a fraud. You have perjured yourself, repeatedly and without remorse. And you have done all of this for one reason: money." He looked directly at Jessica, whose face was now a blank, waxy mask. "You did not see your children as human beings to be loved and nurtured. You saw them as a means to an end, an investment, a pathway to your mother's assets. That is not parenthood. That is a hostile takeover." The judge sat back, his voice returning to a formal, declarative tone. "Therefore, this court rules as follows. The petition for custody filed by Miss Jessica Miller is dismissed, with prejudice. This means it can never be refiled. Permanent sole legal and physical custody of the minor child, Maya Miller, is hereby granted to her grandmother, Mrs. Carol Miller. The existing guardianship of the adult child, Leo Miller, is affirmed as his expressed preference. Furthermore, a permanent restraining order is granted. Miss Jessica Miller is prohibited from contacting, directly or indirectly, her children or Mrs. Carol Miller for a period of 5 years. He banged the gavel. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. "This court is adjourned." It was over. Just like that. The weight of 11 years, the anxiety of the past few months, it all lifted in an instant. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt quiet. I watched as people began to file out, whispering amongst themselves. In the hallway, I saw the final act of the play. Jessica was huddled with her lawyer, her voice a high, desperate whine. "What do we do now?" "We can appeal, right?" Mr. Davies, his face a mask of professional disgust, pulled his briefcase away from her grasp. "There is no we, Miss Miller. You lied to me. You perjured yourself on the stand. My firm is withdrawing as your counsel, effective immediately. You will be billed for our time, and I suggest you find a very good criminal defense attorney. The district attorney's office does not take kindly to perjury." He turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the crowded courthouse hallway. For the first time in over a decade, my daughter was truly, completely, on her own. And all I could think was that the inheritance she had come for, the one she had just lost, was nothing compared to the one she had thrown away all those years ago. And all I could think was that the inheritance she had come for, the one she had just lost, was nothing compared to the one she had thrown away all those years ago. We walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat was radiating up from the blacktop of the parking lot in shimmering waves. After the cold, recycled air of the courtroom, it felt like stepping into an oven, Car doors slammed in the distance. People were talking on their cell phones. Life was just going on. It felt strange, like we had just emerged from a different reality. Maya, who had been a silent, stoic observer through the whole ordeal, reached out and slipped her small hand into mine. Her fingers were cold. Leo walked on my other side, his shoulders back, his face set. He wasn't the little boy I had to carry to the emergency room in the middle of the night anymore. He was a young man, tall and steady, who had just watched his entire childhood be put on trial. I didn't know what to say. Congratulations felt wrong. I'm sorry felt inadequate. So we just walked, a silent, tight-knit unit of 3, toward my sensible decade-old sedan parked at the far end of the lot. And then we saw her. Jessica was standing next to her car, a sleek, silver convertible that looked completely out of place in this sea of minivans and sensible family cars. Her lawyer was gone. Her audience was gone. All the fight, all the righteous indignation had drained out of her, leaving her looking small and hollowed out. She was fumbling in her purse for her keys, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She looked up and saw us approaching. For a moment, her face was a mess of emotions, shame, panic, and a flicker of something else, something that looked almost like hope. As if she thought, even now, that there was a script she could follow, a line she could say that would fix everything. We stopped a few feet away. I instinctively moved a little closer to Maya. "Mom," Jessica said, her voice a raw, broken whisper. It was the first honest sound I'd heard from her all day. I'm so sorry." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The time for apologies had passed a long, long time ago. But Leo stepped forward. He moved with a calm that was far beyond his years. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, the one I'd made sure was properly pressed that morning, and pulled something out. It was a photograph. A 5x7 school picture, the kind that comes in a flimsy cardboard frame. It was the most recent one of him and Maya, taken just last fall. Leo, with his serious, intelligent eyes, had his arm around Maya, who was giving the camera her signature goofy half-smile. They looked happy. They looked like siblings. They looked like a family. He walked right up to Jessica and held it out to her. She looked at the photo, then at him, her eyes wide with confusion. "Here," Leo said, his voice quiet but clear, with no anger in it, only a deep, profound sadness. "So you have something to remember us by." Jessica flinched as if he'd slapped her. She didn't take the photo. Her hands trembled at her sides. "Leo, please," she sobbed, the words tumbling out. "Please, I can fix this. I know I can. I made a mistake, a terrible—" "I know," Leo interrupted, and his voice was so gentle it was devastating. He placed the photograph on the hood of her expensive car, a small, bright square of a life she'd never been a part of. He looked her directly in the eye, and the little boy was gone forever. "Like you said in the voicemail," he said, his voice unwavering. "You do you. Now, we're going to do us." He quoted her own dismissive words back to her, not as a weapon, but as a final verdict, a statement of fact. He was releasing her. He was accepting the truth she had demonstrated for 11 years, that they were on their own paths, and his was moving forward. He turned his back on her then, a simple, final gesture. He walked back to us, took Maya's other hand, and we started walking toward our car again. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel her standing there, a ghost in the hot sun, left with nothing but a glossy picture of the two greatest treasures she had ever possessed, and the echoing silence of her own empty words. The real ledger, the one that tracked love and loss, had finally been balanced, and her account was empty. Her account was empty. And as we drove home that day, leaving her in the rearview mirror, I knew mine was overflowing. Months later, the echo of the gavel has faded, replaced by a different kind of noise. It's the rumble of an oversized red shopping cart, the squeak of its wobbly wheel, and the sound of my grandchildren bickering over the last sample of a mini quiche. We're at Costco on a Saturday. It's loud, it's crowded, and it's the most beautiful sound in the world. "Graham, tell him we don't need the 96-pack of granola bars," Maya says, trying to heave the giant box out of the cart. "But they're on sale," Leo argues, shoving it back in. "It's fiscally responsible." I just laugh. This is it. This is the chaos I fought for, the mundane, glorious everyday business of being a family. We navigate the wide aisles, a small, stubborn ship in a sea of shoppers, our cart piled high with toilet paper, rotisserie chicken, and a giant bag of kettle corn. This is the stability I spent 11 years building: one parent-teacher conference, one late-night nebulizer treatment, one carefully balanced budget at a time. Jessica had talked about her journey, but a journey is supposed to lead you somewhere. Hers led her to a courtroom, alone, with nothing but a portfolio of lies. My journey led me here, to aisle 7, watching my grandson explain the principles of bulk buying to his sister. Some people invest in stocks. Some people invest in wellness brands or yoga retreats. I invested in scraped knees and bedtime stories. I invested in helping with homework and listening to teenage heartbreaks. I invested in showing up. And my returns are priceless. They're in the easy way. Maya leans her head on my shoulder as we wait in the checkout line. They're in the proud look on Leo's face when he tells me he aced his college entrance exams. The world is full of people talking about their truth. They build brands around it, they sell it, they perform it for an audience. But the real truth isn't something you declare, it's something you do. It's in the ledger of your actions, written day by day, in quiet, unseen moments. My daughter tried to inherit a fortune she hadn't earned. But the true inheritance, the one that really matters, is the one you build yourself, with love and time and sacrifice. So let me ask you, if life is the ultimate ledger of what you give and what you get, what will your final balance look like? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the hardest of times.